Hey guys, so today I am going to be doing a little tutorial on how to export as an MOV file, both with and without alpha channels, and then I'm also going to show you how to export as an MP4 file. And I'm also going to tell you when you should use what type of file, so I'll start with that. An MOV file is usually uncompressed. The way that I'm going to show you is how to save an uncompressed MOV file. And usually you want to use that if, for example, you need alpha channels, so you need a clear background in your video that you're exporting. Or if you're going to be bringing that video back into another editing program, you want the maximum quality that you can have. That way when you finish the file and you actually export it in a compressed, streamable format, streamable meaning you can upload it to somewhere like YouTube, you'll get the best possible quality in your output file. So first I'll show you how to export an MOV file without alpha channels. So this is the file that I'm going to export, and we're just going to export it with a black background, and I'll bring it back in here to show that it does in fact have that black background. So you can see right now there's a clear background. If I enable the transparency grid, turn that off, we see it's black. So I'm going to go up to composition, and this is on Windows, by the way. It's going to be pretty much the exact same thing on Mac. I'm going to add this to the After Effects render queue, not the media encoder queue. So add to render queue, and now we get a few options down here. So first thing, you don't need to touch the best settings usually. That's pretty standard. Best settings is what you want to use. It doesn't really change anything other than the length of the video or whether motion blur is turned on or off. That's a very specific setting. So output 2, you want to change where you're saving this, of course, so I'm just going to save it in my motion graphics folder. Doesn't matter, wherever you want to save that. That's how you choose where to save the file. Next I'm going to click on output module, and you want to click on the blue text here. At the top, you're going to click on Format, and you're going to go down to QuickTime. So QuickTime is the long version of the name of an MOV file. MOV files come from QuickTime. So you just click on that, and you see video output is checked here, and you want RGB. There are several options here. You can export RGB, you can export just the alpha channel, or you can export RGB and alpha. So this bottom option is what you would use if you wanted to have a clear background when you export. RGB is what I'm going to use now, so that we can show the black background. Now if there's audio in your sequence, then this has an automatic setting that it's set to by default. Usually if there's no audio, it won't output any audio. If there is audio, then it will. If you're concerned about it, or if you have issues with it, then you can click on this drop down and just turn on the audio or turn off the audio manually. I usually leave it at auto, and it doesn't really change the size of the file or the quality of the file, so I just leave it on. And then if we go over to format options for the video, you can see that there's really nothing that we can change over here because it's not being compressed. It's actually an uncompressed file, which means that there's no loss of data. In a compressed file, you drop some of the data out of the file so that it can be a smaller file size. That's the whole point of compressing videos, so that you could stream it on YouTube or transport the file easily, store it on a smaller hard drive, takes up less space, and also if you're editing with it, it's going to probably run a little faster on a slow computer with compression. So this is okay. We don't need to change anything. You want to make sure that this says animation here for the video codec. If it doesn't, if it says something else on here, then make sure you click on animation, and then we can click OK there, and then we can click OK here. Now we're ready to export, so all we have to do is hit render. So this will take its time to render, and we'll see it pop up in my file. So, and just so we don't have to watch this whole thing render, I'm going to click stop, and it should just stop where it's at and finish the file. Oh, good. So, looks like we ran into an error. Let's see if it actually exported anyway. It's very likely that we did, but the off chance that we didn't, let's see. Yeah, and actually it looks like it's totally fine. So I'm going to turn on the transparency grid again, and this short video, I just want to point out, this short video of just a few seconds long, because it's uncompressed, it actually ended up being about 77 megabytes, which is pretty big for a short video. That's why we use compression, once again. So this is my original file that's not exported. I'm going to drag this video that I did just export onto the layer. Now you can see it brings in the video with a black background. Pretty straightforward. So now I'm going to show the same process with a clear background. So you want it to be see-through. You want to overlay a video on top of something else. We've got some transparency behind these shapes here and whatnot. So you'll be able to see through those objects if there's transparency. So let's begin. Same process, add to render queue. Excuse me. Then we'll go down, select where we want to save it again. Just going to put it in my motion graphics folder again. And you'll notice that now I've got multiple things in the queue. So whatever is checked here, you can see this is checked, but this one isn't. Whatever's checked here is going to render. Whatever isn't checked here, if you have multiple things that you want to render at once, whatever's not checked here won't be rendered. So you can see the render column. You want to make sure that your object is checked when the one that you want to render. So same process again. We'll click on that blue text down there that says lossless. Click on the format dropdown. Select QuickTime, and now we want to change this to RGB plus alpha. So now you can see millions of colors plus, whereas in the regular RGB setting, we just see millions of colors. So that plus means it's got millions of colors plus transparency, or plus an alpha channel. So again, audio output is the same. I'm just going to leave that on auto. And if we click on this, we see animation. That's good. And we can click OK, and click OK again. So now we can hit render again. Oops, I hit the wrong button. We'll hit render. There we go. So now it's rendering. It's going to take its time. I'll let it render for a little bit, just so we have something to see. I think that's sufficient. So I'll click stop, let it compile the file, and make it an MOV file.
So Corbin, am I right to say that if you cancel in the middle of its rendering, it just will do whatever it was able to get to and make that a movie file?
It should. Usually it does. Sometimes you get errors, so you might not end up with a file, but usually it's supposed to. You can see I got another error here. But despite the error last time, it still compiled the file into a playable file. So it's supposed to.
Okay. I feel like that could be an Adobe mantra. Usually it's supposed to.
Yeah. Usually it's supposed to, but sometimes it does not. So now we can see this file's a little bit bigger. I let it render for a little bit longer, I guess. And it only that couple of seconds longer ended up being 128 megabytes. So you got to be careful with uncompressed files if you have a small hard drive, because they do add up very quickly. So going back to this file again, we've got our transparency grid on. You can see through these objects here, so we should be able to see through them in my exported file that I just made. So I'm going to drag this onto the sequence here. Now we see it's like seeing double, because we can see right through everything in this video. So you can see through the little object there. We can still see our transparency grid. If I turn that off, then you can see through to the other objects. You can see right through the video. And it's just as easy as that. If you follow those steps directly, then it should work. Again, Adobe. So now the last thing that we'll go through is exporting an MP4 file. So I'm going to shorten this sequence quite a bit just so it exports quickly. Make it like 1 second long. So now my sequence will just export 1 second of itself. So this is where you need a second program called Adobe Media Encoder. So I'll show you what that looks like now. This is Adobe Media Encoder. This program is dedicated to converting files, rendering files. It's a, like I said, dedicated program. So that means that it's going to be a little more efficient than rendering right in Photoshop or right in After Effects or right in Premiere. This is really meant for like hardcore long-term renders. But also it's a lot more versatile than the built-in rendering system in After Effects. So I'll show you here. I don't have anything really queued up except for what we've already ended. So if you click on the drop down here, there's not a whole lot of stuff that you can export to. And if we go into our codecs again, or our format drop down, there's not a whole lot that you can export to in terms of compressed images. So you can do a PNG sequence, which is technically compressed, or a JPEG sequence, but then that's going to be a series of images rather than a video. So we don't want that. You don't have an option for an MP4 file right in After Effects, and that's where Media Encoder comes in. Same with GIF exporting. You do that in Adobe Media Encoder. So how do we export to Media Encoder? Well, first we go to the composition that we want to export, of course. We go to Composition, and then we select Add to Adobe Media Encoder Queue. So if you don't already have Media Encoder open, then it'll take a little bit to open, and then importing it into Adobe Media Encoder is going to take a minute too. Your first file that you add to Media Encoder is going to take a couple of minutes to add. I don't know why. I think it might be just opening the server between After Effects and Media Encoder. But regardless, don't worry about it if it takes a couple of minutes. Just go get some coffee or something, come back, and it'll be ready. So now we can see we have our template for video file. That's the sequence that I'm trying to export here, so that's good. You can see the name of it here. And now it's actually very similar to the Media Encoder, the render queue in After Effects, where we have our output module here. We have where we're outputting it to. So the name of our file, the folder that we're sending it to. And we have that same sort of stuff here. So we have our output module here on the left. We have some presets in the middle here if you're into that. We're not going to be using that. I'm going to show you how to make the proper output module manually. And then we've got our output location. So just like before, I'm going to save this in the same place just so I know where it is. It's going to be different for you, of course. So now we can click on the blue text here for yours might say something different, but just know that it's under the Format tab. So you can see Format here. It's going to be underneath that. So you can click on this blue text again. It's going to connect to the server that it's already created now. It's a little redundant. Takes a while. Wish it didn't. It's Adobe. Someday. Here we go, and it's opened on one of my other screens, so I'll drag it over. So now we can see our export settings. So if it didn't say H.264 in that blue text that you saw here, now is when you can change that. So you see the format drop down at the top of export settings in your top section here. You're going to drop that down, and you're going to select H.264. Do not select H.264 Blu-ray. That's a special format that's made to be burned directly to a Blu-ray disc. We don't want to use that. It won't play back properly. It's a bad day. So we'll select H.264. There are plenty of other file types that you can use for exporting as well, but H.264 is the standard MP4 file type. So next, we're going to set up our settings here. So just going to make this window a little bigger so we can see things a little easier. So first things first, you want to make sure that you're looking at the right video. So on the left, you have your preview pane. You can actually scrub through it a little bit and see your video in motion. If you notice anything is missing, now is the time to fix that back in After Effects. So that's important. You want to make sure that you're exporting the right file. So now we can select, just like in the After Effects renderer, we have the option to export video and export audio. So if you want there to be audio in your file, then you want this to be checked. Same with video. If you're trying to output a video file, which it would only make sense that you're trying to, you want to make sure that this is checked. If it's not checked, then there's not going to be any preview. So that's a pretty obvious sign. You're not going to get any settings, so make sure that this is checked. Next, you'll see that there are a bunch of checkboxes here. This is going to match, these checkboxes will match your sequence settings or your composition settings in After Effects. So we really don't have to change a whole lot over here because it should be the right size. My document is 1920 pixels by 1080 pixels, so we see that grayed out here. Can't change that if this is checked. If we uncheck this and we want it to be a different size, then we can edit these, but we don't have to now. So something that I always check is render at maximum depth. This will have the best color output possible. This will just ensure that it takes its time when outputting color. If you're trying to export quickly, then you can leave this unchecked, but just know that the colors are going to be a little bit off from what you expect. Very, very slightly. You're probably not going to notice it unless you have a very, very careful eye. But I like to check this all the time just to make sure that I know that the colors that I set in After Effects are outputting properly. Next, we'll scroll past the encoding settings. This should be all whatever is best for your system already, so no need to fiddle with this. We can't anyway, since it's all grayed out here. So we're going to scroll all the way down to bitrate settings. So this is where we might have to change some things. So my general rule of thumb for the bitrate settings is if your document is 1080p or smaller, then just keep the target bitrate at 10 and the maximum bitrate at 12. And you might be wondering, what does this all mean? Literally, it just means how much data per second. So the target bitrate is what the program will try to strive for. If there isn't enough data to meet this bitrate, so say you have a very small file and it'll only take maybe 3 megabits per second to render the file, then it'll use the highest possible bitrate that it can, but chances are it's not going to use that full 10 megabits per second that you've set. So it's measured in megabits per second, not megabytes per second, so don't think, oh man, this is going to be a 1,000 megabyte or a gigabyte file just because it's set at 10 here. It will even itself out. You can see the estimated file size at the bottom if you're concerned about file size. So my general rule of thumb again is if it's 1080p, so 1920 by 1080 or smaller, use these two settings. It's already set here because that's the default for 1080p video. If it's bigger than that, then you can increase this. Really depends on the size of the video file. Most of us following this tutorial aren't going to be using anything higher than 1080p, but say you're encoding in 4K, you might want 18 or 20 megabits per second for your bitrate. So now the last thing, I am not going to be exporting audio, but I'll show you the settings that you should use for audio export. So you want your bitrate for the audio to be the highest that it can be. It's not going to make your file much bigger. So you want this to be 320 if it's stereo, or it'll be slightly smaller if that is mono audio, so only one channel. And that should be the only thing that you have to change there. And now the final thing that we have to do in this window is we will click on Use Maximum Render Quality. So again, this will make sure that it renders the compression, so not the colors per se, but this does have to do with the colors as well. So it will compress the file at the highest possible quality. So I'm going to click OK now. And now you can see our preset has changed. So it says custom. That's good. Means that we applied our settings. Now, finally, we can hit play as long as we've got our destination set. So if you haven't done that yet, do that before you hit the play button. So that little play arrow will render. We'll start the render, rather. And that was just a 1-second video, so that went nice and quick. So now we can click on this link again, and that'll actually just open up a window with the location of our file. And here's our MP4 file. If we click on this, it'll open in whatever program you have set, and you can see it plays just fine. So I have this program set to loop the video, so that's why it's playing over and over again. And that is just about it. However, I do have a couple of troubleshooting steps for you. So if you notice that your file is exporting and it's got some like green and red stripes all over the video, it just doesn't look right, it looks glitchy and whatnot, then something that you can do to try and fix that is you can change the rendering engine. So the reason that this happens sometimes is if you have an older or out-of-date driver for your graphics card, or if you don't have a graphics card, then it might not be playing well with the program with hardware acceleration. So that means using a special chip on your hardware, in order to help render faster. Basically, that's the best way to put it. Is it's trying to help it render faster. So you can change this drop down to say software only. So you can see GPU acceleration and software. GPU acceleration uses the hardware, software does not. That just uses your CPU. So you can click on that. It'll render probably a lot slower, but you might get a better result and it might fix that common issue. So yeah, that's all we got.
Thank you so much, Corbin. That's really comprehensive. And I love how you included so many troubleshooting things.
Yeah, no problem. Is there anything else that, any questions that you guys have before I stop the recording, by the way?
You can stop the recording. I just have to